good afternoon, good evening, good day from the different parts of the world. It's afternoon for me. And I want to say it's good to see all of you, but I don't see 90% of you. And there's a part of me that's a bit like, oh, because it's good for me when I see people's faces, then I know who I'm talking to. And also, for community, it's just for me, it's just good to see your faces as we're going through these processes and how you're processing, where you are you feeling confused? Are we stuck? So if you can, it's not obligatory, but it's great for me to see your faces and for me to know who I'm talking to. And I'm sure there are people also who like to see other people's faces from different parts of the world. So I think I would just like to invite us to just take a moment, and if you wish to close your eyes, just a moment of silence just to bring us together here, and to bring ourselves in connection with each other, and just to follow our breath. Thank you. Thank you so much. So, as Bianca was already saying, is that we've been together and we've been organizing this process of, I think I would call it a journey of more understanding what colonization is and how does it impact us, how does it impact our communities, and how it impacts Men Engage and the work that we do. And so it's not up to us as a core team to decide everything of what these series are going to be about. So I just want to emphasize that we're inviting you as members to get involved in this process, to write to Bianca, and whatever thought processes you have, whatever ideas you have, whatever topics that you think we need to be discussing and how we should be discussing them, it's really up to you. And it will be great if you participate after this and write to her and give your proposals and your ideas. And if you feel like there's something you want to share, you can also be part of the panel. If you have research, you have some knowledge, that is really very much encouraged and welcome. We are not experts on this topic. We are here to create a space of learning together and challenging each other together and growing together. My name is Nontokozo, as Bianca has already mentioned, and I'm originally from South Africa, but I'm based in Europe at the moment. And today, I would just like to say, if when I'm talking, it's easy for me to follow my thought processes when there's no too much writing in the chat. However, when we are having a group discussion, it's okay to write on the chat and share our thinking processes. Today's session, mainly we plan to focus more on ourselves and how this colonization affect us, and in a personal way and also in our communities. And hopefully that after this we can together have some sense of where we are, what we want to change, and what are the challenges. And we're going to begin with going into, I don't know, are we ready, Bianca, for the breakout rooms, just to check in?
I just need 31 more minutes.
It's okay. So we're going to go into breakout rooms and just do a check-in on how we are, how we're landing, and who we are. We'll have about 7 minutes to do that, 7 to 8 minutes. So give each other a chance just to speak and say hello. And then we're going to come back and begin the session. Just say hello, who you are, where you are, and how are you landing today. So thank you for being here today. As Bianca was already saying, this is our second session, and we felt that in this session, we would like to work more on how does colonization our communities and our thinking processes. So the invitation from me today is I'm going to talk about something that's called learning zones. And some of you have seen this before, maybe. And learning zones are, it's a concept of, as a people, when we learn, there's a space where we learn, where we feel comfortable and we feel rested. But most of the time, in order for us to be able to learn and absorb new information into our bodies and our minds, it's when we are challenged, right? When we feel a little bit of discomfort and feeling unable to come in. And sometimes that challenge or what's making us uncomfortable could result into a sense of panic. And when we are in the panic zone, our bodies shut down, our minds shut down, and we are no longer able to participate or absorb information. And why am I showing this today? The reason I'm doing this is the invitation is, as we go through today, is for you to be constantly checking how is your body processing the information, because some of this information could be triggering, it could be re-traumatizing, it could be uncomfortable to hear as well. So to be constantly checking on yourself, or are you still being challenged, or are you now going towards the panic zone, right? And to find ways to regulate your body through breathing, like just constantly don't forget to breathe. I always say when I'm doing these trainings is just always go back into your breath, focus on the breathing, but also checking with your body. How is my body doing now? How is the information that I'm getting affecting my nervous system? So one of the things you could do, you could just stand up and start shaking your body, or you could walk around in the room that you're in if you're able to do that. So it's all about really just taking care of ourselves and taking care of each other. And also as a group to just find ways to have compassion with each other and have some patience with each other with the things that we say, because this is not a space of who's right and who's wrong, who's an expert. It's a learning space where we are here together to process together. And at the same time, I also just want to mention that with this learning zone map is people who are constantly under trauma, and people who live in the margins, they are most of the time experiencing the discomfort. So they are never in the center, they're never in the learning comfort and rest. People who are living in the margins are mostly always in the panic zone or in the discomfort and challenge zone. So to have awareness of that as well, that some of us might spend most of our time in the panic zone, and some of us might have the skills and the tools to know how, or also systemically that our privileges allow us to feel comfortable and to know how to rest. So it depends on where we are, and it depends also on the situations and the traumas that we carry with us. We've decided to approach this work today using a sense of, because colonization, talking about colonization is really hard, right? I can just feel it in my body because already my mind is going into the different directions, right? Of, oh my gosh, what do we talk about and what do we leave in today? What do we leave out? How do we approach this topic? And I wanted to just share this picture here that I didn't create this picture, but I did change the center of it. And the center of it was colonization, and I put violence in it because this is how I see colonization. My experience of colonization is that it is violence. And the different connections, these connections are not in any particular order, so therefore you can change them around the way that is comfortable and the way that it feels right, and sometimes also even add some things. So it's not about it's correct or incorrect. It's an example of how everything is really connected, and the center for it being colonization, and for me being violence itself. And just for those who are translating, I'm just going to read them out so they can be translated. And right on top, we have racism, and we have white supremacy, we have capitalism, we have individual over community, environmental terrorism, man destroys nature, settler colonialism, misogyny, patriarchy, toxic masculinity. And sometimes when I work with feminist movements in Europe, I also add white feminism, because as we know, white feminism has also a history of being one-sided, that is not inclusive and not including women of color into their discourse. So this can be used in any way that feels right for the moment. So today I want to introduce the work of Andrea Smith. Before I introduce the work of Andrea Smith, I want to give the background of why I came across and how I come across the work of Andrea Smith. I've been holding spaces, I don't know if to call them trainings, holding spaces for people of color, BIPOC people. And we gather together for about 9 days. And over the period of 3 years doing this, just focusing on BIPOC groups, every time we come together, on the second day, there will always be conflict. So on the second day, there's already heated conflict. And we come together with an idea, right? That there's this idea that when BIPOC people, when we gather together, then it's a given that it's a safe space. And it's a space that when we can finally feel safe, we are together and we can process and do our healing together. And we found that it actually doesn't work that way because we are so diverse as a BIPOC people, right? We come from different backgrounds, we have a different history, we have different experiences of oppressions. And not only do we have different experiences of oppressions, but we also don't agree on how we dismantle this, how to go about dismantling these oppressions. So I was very curious as a facilitator, why every second day we get into this intense conflict all the time. And what I also noted was this conflict always happens when we're doing the session on intersectionality. There's always some disagreement on how to approach this. And in the beginning, it will come up as, no, we are doing oppression Olympics. And this really made me curious in the sense of, I think it's more than that. I don't think it's oppression Olympics. There is something more besides of the fact that we are diverse. There's something more that is happening here in the field. And since then, I went into doing really digging and researching on what exactly is going on here. What is what is this, what's behind this diversity, what's behind this disagreement? And I realized that actually we cannot avoid this conflict, and I don't want us to avoid this conflict, but it's more like learning to face it and learning to name it and learning to name what's going on between us. And what I found for me was it's very much connected, of course, with colonization, with white supremacy that is moving in our bodies. So with that, doing research, I then came across the work of Andrea Smith, which for me was like an aha moment, because then it gave me words that I was able to explain what was going on in depth. We're not going to go I'm not going to go deep into her work. I'm just going to summarize her work. And she calls her work, you can Google it, I will send the link later. It's called Heteropatriarchy and the Three Pillars of White Supremacy, right? And she based her work, and she was working with different women of color, looking at why women of color sometimes disagree when they come together on how to dismantle oppressions. For example, you'll find some maybe Black women saying women from Algeria are not Black enough. White passing people should not be in the space with BIPOC people. How do we approach anti-Blackness? So there's so many different levels of how do we approach this work, from which angle, and who qualifies as being oppressed, who's more oppressed, and who's less oppressed. And she talks about these three pillars of white supremacy. And so I'm just going to invite you again to just remember to breathe. And if anything is re-traumatizing, to just center yourself in your breathing. I'm saying this to myself also because I find some of this work also sometimes a little bit like, oof, my body gets a bit triggered. So the three pillars are slavery and capitalism. And we have genocide, capitalism. And we have Oriental and war. Historically, the way we are affected by colonization is completely different. Hence, it creates this conflict when we come together. First of all, the word BIPOC on itself is a word that we're not in agreement with. It comes from white supremacy itself. So therefore, everything that we do, including the work we do to decolonize, it's still based on colonial ways of thinking and colonial ways of processing. So how do we find ways outside of this thinking if everything we are, the way we think, the way we process is based on colonial way of being? So she talks about slavery and capitalism, and this way she explains that Black people, in a way, the logic of slavery says inherently Black people are slaveable, right? Blackness then becomes equated with slave ability, right? And since she's based in the US, she also talks about how from slavery, it has also moved to the prison system. And therefore, this gives the idea of the other group of BIPOC, people who don't identify as Black people, then to see themselves as long as I am not Black, therefore I am not in the bottom of the triangle. So it gives a sense of safety, right? I am oppressed, but I'm not as oppressed as Black people are, right? So this is when it starts to create a sense of Olympics and diversity, right? Who's more oppressed and who's less oppressed, and how do you get involved and how you don't get involved. And she moves on to explain about genocide and capitalism. And genocide and capitalism is based on the indigenous people, right? The idea that the indigenous people have to disappear, right? Colonization comes in and takes the land, the resources, spirituality, and the culture of the indigenous people. So the indigenous people need to disappear, or they need to play dead. Basically, they need to be docile, right? And this is another way, right, of oppressing a different group of people, which then looks different from the slavery. And you also, then she argues on Oriental and war, and this she bases it on this idea is of there is this empire, right, of in the Orient. However, this empire is based on exotic, but it's inferior, right? And because it's an empire, so therefore that means that it's a constant threat to the Western empire. So therefore it justifies the constant continuation of war and as well as immigration laws, right? That this doesn't mean that the immigration laws only apply to people from that side of the world, but this is the basis of it. This is the argument of it, that, okay, we need to be constantly in war because this empire is threatening our empire. The way of being of the other is threatening our way. So therefore, it's important that we are constantly at war and defending ourselves. And one might then ask, if I am a person of color, if I'm a white-bodied person and then I'm from the Western world, how does colonization and all of this, right, affects me? But before we get to that, she also talks about when it comes, it's not only about, in a sense of racism, it's not only just about white supremacy as such, it's also about really promoting heteronormative ways of being, which then connects to Christianity as well, in a sense of fighting to keep fighting against same-sex marriages, which then in a way it's argued that the Orient or certain cultures and religions see this as a weakness when they see the Western world allowing same-sex marriages, see this as a weakness. And therefore, if there's a weakness, they have a right to come in and attack. It goes deeper than that, but I would invite you to go read her paper, which then goes deeper into explaining why she's arguing that, right? So it gives an excuse to say, in the Western world, we shouldn't continue to promote same-sex marriages because then it's opening us to being weak. We are seen as weak, and therefore we need to protect ourselves, and we need to protect ourselves against terrorism. We need to protect ourselves through engaging in war with those countries that see us, as a threat through promoting same-sex marriages. I hope I'm making sense. I need to breathe. Are there any questions so far from the floor?
I have one, Nontokozo, if no one else does. And I'm sure in a way you've explained it, but I'd love to understand it a little bit better, I guess, is this idea of oppression Olympics. I wasn't quite sure I understood what you meant by that. So I wonder if you could explain that a little bit more.
So Operation Olympics is this concept that, as I've explained, so when we gather together, we always, whether it's people in the margins or whether it's mixed groups, when we gather together to talk about our oppressions, there's always the idea of some people feeling that their oppressions are more, they've suffered more than other people. So it's always a sense of, okay, you saying you went through that, but hey, I went through something worse than you. So therefore, my oppressions need more attention. My oppressions are the ones that need to be taken care of first before yours, which then brings a sense of conflict and disagreement, right? On whose oppressions are more important, whose oppressions are less important. And the idea, how she has approached this work, is to show that it's not about Olympics. It's really the reality historically of the different ways of how we being oppressed, how colonization was designed, that makes these differences. So it's not something that is, it's not just an expression, it's really a reality of there are differences, and how can we learn these differences and find ways to work with these differences in order to work together to create strategies to dismantle this the oppressions.
There is a message in the chat from Zaki Salai. Thank you for this presentation. I simply wanted to share that being from the Sudanese diaspora in the UK, it is really encouraging to see you name Orientalism within the global imperialist oppression of today. Our Black Arab African diaspora, especially my sisters in the community, manage so many overlapping layers of marginalization and disempowerment. Orientalism is a fundamental lens.
Sure.
Thank you, Zaki.
Thank you, Zaki. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, if I can just quickly seek a clarification.
Yes.
I couldn't raise my hand. I'm actually speaking from Abuja, Nigeria. I don't know whether within the framework of conceptualization, you have attempted to understand the differential in terms of reasoning between the diasporans and the aborigines, that is the Africans, Black Africans in diaspora, and and those back home, in terms of their perception and reasoning. One might be tempted to say those in diaspora, probably they are product of slavery and all of that, but we also have internal slavery that have a different dimension in the African region, given the dominance of ethnicity over others. So I've just wanted to understand whether that reasoning has come within your conceptualization.
Thank you for the question. I'm going to do my best in the way that I understand how to answer that question. I'm going to connect it mostly in terms of how I understand it and how it makes sense to me. It's when, for example, when we work on racism, I find that the people from the diaspora and the people from Africa have a different approach to the work, right? It again creates a sense of diversity, and sometimes it could be a source of conflict, right? Because the experiences are different, right? The lived experiences are different. And I think this is what also she's talking about, which then will come into having different ideas on how to strategize and how to work towards dismantling racism or any other oppressions. So for me, in my research, what I found is one needs to make space of that understanding. One needs to make space of that history that you're talking about, that those who were in the diaspora, whether through slavery or through immigration, are having a different experience than the African people who remained in Africa. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks for the insight. Thanks. Yeah.
So there's always, for me, the call is, if we understand the history and we understand that there's different experiences and make space for that, then we are able to come together in a sense of finding a strategy that works for everybody, rather than insisting that our strategy is the right strategy. This is how we need to decolonize. There are different ways of decolonizing, and these ways are linked to the history of experiencing colonization. Yes, thank you. So there's also points that are being made on the chat itself. And also it's contextual. So one has to always think about where I am in the world and which time am I referring to, right? What's happening in that moment as well, right? It's always shifting. I don't see everybody. Is there anybody else that wants to reflect or wants to say something and would like to share?
Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you so much for these thoughts. I think that question just now about diaspora is really interesting, not only for African diaspora. We also have in the Caribbean and other parts of the world, we have an Indian or South Asian diaspora, even in South Africa, Mauritius, and for various reasons. And even that South Asian diaspora is not what's the word? It's not all the same, because you might have people of different religions, different origins, and so on. But what I know from being a descendant of Indian indentured immigrants living in Guyana is that I look back to not only colleagues in South Africa and in Mauritius and Fiji and in other places, Suriname, elsewhere, to see how they are dealing with some of the issues as it affects those who have descended, who are descendants of indentureship. But it has also been interesting to look back, especially to India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, in a contemporary way, to see, for example, as we talk about issues like sexual orientation and gender identity, in terms of how India and those places are decolonizing when it comes to those issues. So therefore, we can then speak back, usually to a Christian majority. And in Guyana, that Christian majority is a very Black majority. So sometimes we have the problem of how do we speak against Christian oppression without seeming racist. And that's another, because if Blackness is defined, like Uganda has an anti-homosexual bill just passed. If I'm going to criticize Uganda for doing that, am I being anti-Black? Right? And these are the difficult kinds of discussions which are also emerging when the identity, where gender becomes, say, less than ethnicity or other privilege, that happens within the place. So I just put that into the conversation, and to say that one of the nice things about the Men Engage Alliance is learning from others in the South. And we've got to be, and I'll say this very carefully, we do not look very much to the USA, because the USA has a particular way of dealing with things which cannot be replicated. It's not the same as, there's slightly different issues in our countries, because our dominance is not white dominance. It's either Black dominance or other well, there might be colonial issues still, decolonizing to work. But it is easy that when sometimes people who are oppressing in our countries adopt the language of the oppressed from North America, and then things become very complicated. But I appreciate when, for example, we look to Nigeria and South Africa and all of those other countries in which people are questioning and opening up all of these discussions. And we see where there's how does decolonizing reverse into this. And I'm just appreciate Men Engage Alliance for giving us this space to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pita. I think I had similar lines of thought as well. But also I wanted to bring in a little more of the politics in the picture, particularly from the politics that have evolved from gender analysis, no, and gender and power analysis, and to look at the aspect of one, the relational aspect versus the systemic approach, and how that further complexifies I was more reflecting on the point, Nontokozo, that you were raising around why on this day, the second day, we in the BPOIC so-called group start fighting with each other. Also is because that we have been put or shaped in a way to sort of only look at it at a relational level, not so much at the structural level, right? I think understanding the fact that at a structural level, we all are suffering and the root cause of it is the same, but we don't want to acknowledge that and go into, because that's a little more cerebral exercise than to what our daily experiences have been. And it's difficult to move into that cerebral exercise while we actually are experiencing things very differently in our daily lives. And is that the reason? No? And then what is the solution to that? At the same time, how do we balance our analysis into understanding from a decolonization or decolonialism in a particular sense, no? And is that resulting into those who created this kind of terms or mentalities or knowledge base within us, those identify as Black or non-Black or not, or rather put it non-white, in that sense, continue struggling. But also, if we remember in the first session, we talked about colonization not only taking place at this moment in time in physical terms, right? We have, whether or not identify as colonizers or closer to them, we have indeed inherited our knowledge base from there. And those of us who speak English are more closer in that realm to closer towards so-called colonizers. And those who cannot speak English or have access to this space that we have continue to be marginalized. Again, their voices are not heard. So how do we understand decolonization within this complexity? And also there is a particular dimension which is relevant for Men Engage to think about, is around the masculinities piece of it. And when there is this piece that we need to think as men or as women or as gender diverse population, because of our identities, we do bring another dimension to who is impacted the most by the colonization, and on top, the gender division of colonization. So I think just wanted to bring that to closer to our house as well, so that we start feeling uncomfortable of the fact that those of us male identified individuals here are in a powerful position in that sense, no? And how do we understand that, to unpack what even then decolonization means vis-a-vis decolonizing the gendering of aspect as well. So yeah, I just wanted to share that thoughts. While you were sharing, that thought came out in me.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other comments from the floor? Or processes? Yeah. Yeah, I think what I'm hearing, I think from both of you, is the emphasis on it's not about those who colonized, who's the colonizer, who's not. It's the very center of it is that we are all colonized and we all have certain behaviors. We've adapted those behaviors, right? That were in our thinking processes and how we live and how we treat each other. Colonization is just part of us, right? So how do we get out of this? How do we get out of this red race of colonization? It goes beyond color, right? It goes beyond race. It's a way of thinking. It's a way that we've adapted, right? So how do we decolonize, really? How do we come together and create those strategies of decolonizing together without pointing fingers on who's not colonized and who's colonized, who's the colonizer, right? Because we are all behaving from that center of colonization. And so I would like us, if there's nothing else, somebody else, please unmute yourself, because really there's 3 pages and I can't see everybody.
Sorry.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. So hi, Zaki from Scotland speaking. I just want to say, like, sometimes I find, thank you for today. It's really interesting hearing everyone's perspectives. Really great, particularly hearing from those from the Caribbean and from the African continent. Thank you. What I was going to say is, I think, so personally, I get a level of frustration sometimes at how sometimes we are maybe trying to reinvent the wheel on some occasions. I'm not a person who only says, look to history or have all the answers. I don't believe that at all. But I think for me, I take particular inspiration from the African liberation movements of the 1980s in Mozambique, in other Portuguese, like Lusophone African countries, because they were dealing with multiple diversities and anti-sexist thought and philosophy and strong feminisms of the 80s, right in the midst of their anti-colonial liberation fight. And so the kind of discussions around masculinity, about femininity, about gender and sex, me personally, I feel very privileged that I was made aware of the writings of people like Samora Machel, Amilcar Cabral early on, but also their surviving partners like Graça Machel, who's leading like a foundation in Africa now. These are people I look to really try and tease out what I think about masculinity and sexism in this day and age, where I see a lot of confusion where I live in the West, a lot of confusion and conflict between who people I think desperately need solidarity. I draw a lot of inspiration from particularly the Lusophone, the Portuguese-speaking African liberation movements, who are dealing with a lot of stuff around sexism back in the 80s, and had some very progressive approaches. So I just share that I think looking back to that can be incredibly helpful. But particularly, a lot of these people are still alive and still active, but their voices maybe are not as high profile as they had been in the past. So Graça Machel, if you're not aware of her, I try and look up her foundation a lot. It's maybe a different tack than what we're talking about here, but I think it's relevant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, I wanted to share a bit about who can help to reduce or to fight this colonization or decolonization, who can play the role so that it's not there. I think this is the responsibility for everyone, because it's depending on where you are and when you are there, because everyone can be at risk, and the responsibility should be shared. And I think if we consider everyone as a human, based on human rights, considering and value each other, that could help us to play the role in terms of fighting this behavior. For me, I consider it as a behavior which is not great for everyone, and it can help. But I think we should start maybe reflecting on a kind of ecological model on how to evolve everyone at different stage, so that make sure that we are really tackling the situation very well and we can fight it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm reminded, listening to both of you, I'm reminded with this idea of decolonization is not a new thing, right? Decolonization happened as soon as colonization began. So it began at that point. So it's about really looking historically who's been what are the means and the strategies that have been used that are now suppressed that we don't know about, that what can we learn from history? What can we learn from those who've been in the front lines, or historically those documented books written about it, rather than to think this is something new and we need to reinvent the wheel, as it was said before, that it's not something new. It happened from the beginning, but how can we take that knowledge and maybe also add on some new knowledge in order to move forward together? And as a human species, as it's already been mentioned, to look at it from that way, without, of course, marginalizing or would say not looking at people. Different groups are affected differently, and obviously there will need to be space to look at those different oppressions. But at the same time, I think for myself, if we look at colonization, we definitely need to work together in order to move forward. With that said, I see Ellen.
Thank you. I just want to throw another piece of the conundrum into the mix, an understanding I gained about 5 or 6 years ago from Atono Odam, a U.S. southern border with Mexico woman who's also an international attorney. She mentioned that not only did the Catholic Church proclaim and give permission with the doctrine of discovery for Europeans to colonize and steal from the world, but also that philosophy, that idea, that excuse, but also it is still the legal underpinning of ongoing colonialization and possession. And if it can be overturned, and there are appeals to the Pope to overturn it, then it would make a huge legal difference. It would, enable ongoing legal struggles for years and decades, no doubt. But I didn't realize it was actually still a legal basis, not just a philosophical basis.
Thank you for sharing that. I also didn't realize it's still on legal basis. So that's shocking, disturbing news for me. So maybe we just remember to breathe. So I'm going to share my screen just a little bit again. So my invitation is to look back to, if we look back to this map that I'd showed before, as a guide, and I invite us to we're going to go into breakout rooms and to look at this question. This is just a guiding process question. We don't have to follow this question. We can discuss whatever is it that is moving inside of us right now. So on the personal level, the invitation is about looking at how you yourself, how do I recognize my own internalized belief systems, right? And how does colonial behavior, right, show up in us? And how am I upholding the systems of white supremacy, right? So to let these three questions be, they're similar, but just to be a guide in the process of answering your questions. So as I was writing the questions down, for me, what came up is, I remember when I was living in South Africa, I mean, it's really a small example, but I could just feel the shame that was coming in my body as I was thinking about it. The idea that, because I grew up in the city, I grew up in Johannesburg, and the idea of thinking that people who live in the rural areas were less intellectual. People who were living in rural areas, they knew less. So just by virtue of me coming from a city, that it was assumed, I assumed that I'm more intelligent, I'm more smart, I know more than the people who are coming from the villages. And also the idea of language, which was already mentioned, that me speaking English, it was this idea of if you speak English, it makes you smarter. The people who don't know how to speak English, they're less intelligent. And these are the ideas that I grew up in. These are the ideas that I grew up believing, right? And part of my decolonizing personal process is realizing that that is white supremacy that is moving inside of me, right? This way of thinking. So yeah, I'm feeling embarrassed. So these are the processes that it might sound small, but it has an impact on how we interact with others, on how we interact with the world, and how we treat ourselves, right? So it's from the personal things into community and into the laws and everything. So what we think is important and what we think is acceptable and what we think is not acceptable. So I invite us to just go into groups and just pinpoint what behaviors that are instilled in you that are very much colonial and are very much based on white supremacy and that you have internalized. Yeah.
Nontokozo, how long do you want the breakout rooms for?
Since you say it's about 4 to 5 people, we can have like 20 minutes or maybe, yeah, let's make 20 minutes.
Okay, I'm ready whenever you want me to put people in.
Okay. Okay, so remember to breathe and give each other space to speak and share. And you're not forced to share as well. But if you do share, make sure that you give others a chance to share as well.
I will very quickly say one sentence that it was challenging for me while listening to the colleagues who are sharing, coming from a land which those who wrote the history made us think that we were never colonized, a country called Nepal. And understanding how colonization impacted us was a bit challenging for me.
Thank you for sharing that. It's also, I would like to make an invitation to hear more from women as well. We've been hearing more from men today. What's moving? We don't have to share exactly what was said, but what moved you? What touched you?
I can share briefly. Well, in my team, we realized that we came from very, very different contexts and histories and stories. But we saw, we were able to see and to recognize how each one of us have internalized our position, our privileged and oppressed positions in the system. How they have made us feel better than others or worse than other people. Yes, like being less or more according to our skin color, the place we live, our family names, for example. If we are, of course, men or women, and how we, even though we try not to reproduce that, it's like inside each one of us. It's like what we grew up with, and it's challenging to go against that.
Thank you.
Antes que iniciar, quiero agradecer estos espacios porque sí nos llevan a mover esas conciencias, ¿no? Esa postura crítica. Muchas gracias. Bueno, yo tenía la idea de que la colonización iba meramente enfocada a esa apariencia física, a ese color de piel. Y yo decía, hay una supremacía blanca, y entonces como yo soy de otro color que no es blanco, pues entonces me ubican en una escala más baja. Sin embargo, ahorita con tu exposición, que agradezco mucho, y la intervención de mi compañero Julio Florán en la mesa que me tocó, me di cuenta pues de que no es solamente el color de piel, la apariencia, sino que tiene que ver con todo un sistema de creencias que hemos incorporado durante nuestra vida, nuestra historia de la comunidad, de nuestro país. Y en ese vivir cotidiano hemos estado incorporando elementos de esa supremacía blanca que tiene que ver con que el que yo tenga educación, y otra comunidad no la tenga, entonces no valido su saber, porque yo sí tengo saber, ¿no? Porque soy educada y tengo una profesión. Entonces ellos no tienen un saber cuando la comunidad tiene su propio saber legítimo, validado, que le da su propia hacer de su cultura, ¿no? Y cómo ahora, empiezo a ver que, pues que no es solamente la apariencia, sino que puede ser mi sistema de creencias de que yo soy heterosexual, de que vivo en un lugar residencial o no residencial, de que vive en una comunidad o en otra, de que tenga una escolaridad universitaria o no la tenga, de que tenga un idioma o tenga varios idiomas. O sea, cómo eso me coloca en una supremacía distinta y me hace pensar que tengo esa supremacía, ¿no? Y que desde ahí yo tengo ese pensamiento colonizador que no me libera y que no me deja pensar que los otros, que no son tal los otros, sino que somos iguales porque estamos en esta vida con una experiencia y donde lo mejor sería disfrutarla y no estar en una, como decías, en una lucha constante contra el otro, ¿no? Y no estar validando las violencias que estamos generando con estos pensamientos colonizadores. Sí siento, como dices, en el cuerpo, como tengo las manos frías de estar pensando en este tema que tenemos que estar trabajando en lo individual, de cómo lo reproducimos, cómo nos afecta, porque nos autoexcluimos o nos excluyen, pero también cómo nosotros también excluimos a otros, ¿no? Entonces, agradezco mucho este seminario. Gracias.
Thank you for sharing and also for mentioning your body symptoms. Yeah, how you're feeling it in your body and how it's moving you in your body, because it affects our nervous system, right? Our thinking processes and creates body symptoms, right? Thank you for sharing that.
I can share something. We were talking about the dissonance that can occur when you grow up as a white person. I've heard you talk, Nontokozo, in other sessions about rank and how we tend to identify with our lowest rank. So I was sharing that my idea of my family's history has always been that it's a working class history that I've been very proud of, but working class in the northern part of Sweden, which is also like it's not the center, it's the periphery of a peripheric country, but how I came to realize how working class families from southern parts of Sweden 150, 200 years ago were brought up to the northern parts to colonialize and settle in Sapmi country. So my ancestors were actually also very much part of a colonial project of occupying and pushing the Sapmi population away from their lands and claiming it as Swedish land, and how that is still a very silent sort of history in Sweden, and we don't talk about it, and the dissonance it can create when you sort of can think that my family has been on the side of people that have been struggling against oppression, and realize that you're also part of, you have been very much an instrument in oppression. And I don't know. And when we talked about that also with a colleague from North America, we don't know what our ancestors knew and understood and experienced about what they were part of, but how that is sort of living in us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ana. Edgar, sí, puedes hablar en español. This translation. Saludos.
Edgar de Ecuador. A mí me llama mucho la atención en términos personales, cómo nosotros también en este proceso de descolonización también la reproducimos inconscientemente en nuestros espacios. Porque yo hacía una similitud, por ejemplo, en algún momento, por ejemplo, los haitianos que salen, en este caso, salen de su país a República Dominicana, son denigrados, son, en este caso, de manera despectiva, tratados por las personas de República Dominicana. Y de manera despectiva le dicen negro, por ejemplo, cuando también, pues yo digo, hay una relación. Entonces, lo que quiero decir es que finalmente, no solo en ese ejemplo, ¿no? En un montón de ejemplos nosotros inconscientemente también reproducimos la colonización sobre otras personas, y eso tiene que ver mucho en términos a las relaciones de poder. Entonces, tratamos de ejercer como el control y la manipulación a través de diferentes esferas, ¿no? En el grupo reflexionábamos y veíamos cómo, por ejemplo, alguien porque tiene un título profesional que es doctor, por ejemplo, decíamos, es superior a alguien que es un licenciado, por ejemplo, en educación. Y la otra persona, porque lo decíamos, alguien porque puede hablar con facilidad inglés es superior a alguien que no sabe hablar inglés, ¿sí? Alguien de la ruralidad, lo decíamos también antes. Entonces, pero nosotros lo reproducimos. Nosotros que estamos cuestionando la colonización, también reproducimos permanentemente hasta en espacios que tratan de emancipar, reproducimos también la colonización. Eso nomás era. Muchas gracias.
A ti, muchas gracias. Yes, I think we're stating, right, the complexity of how do we get out of colonization when we are so deeply entrenched into thinking and feeling and being colonized, right? Yeah. Yes, please.
You know, I've been reading recently an indigenous, excuse me, scholar that's in North America. And she talks about, her name is Melanie Goodchild. She's amazing. And she talks about how indigenous languages, certainly all in the Americas, and I've heard from Maori colleagues in New Zealand as well, that the languages are process-oriented and very contextual and more verb-based. And English, for sure, is very much more noun-based. And so when you have a noun, you can have a category. And when you have a category, you've got things in different categories: English speaker, non-English speaker, white, brown, black, educated, less educated, uneducated, whatever. Then from there, you can have a hierarchy. You can see how it all stacks up. And so one of the practices that she talks about is, how can you verbify, which isn't really a word in English, but it's a process, right? So how can we think in verbs more, even as a native English speaker? And so it's a challenge for me, but it does make me stop and reframe.
Thank you.
actually, according to me, like colonization is a process and decolonization is an anti-process to that. But the thing is, during the colonization, the country or the group which colonizes another group or country, they come with some superiority complexes in their ways of life, in their traits and physical traits, their dressing sense, their culture, their social system, everything. So when even after when they leave that country, when they leave that country or place independent, the traces remain, and these traces do not go for years and even centuries. People still, like the people who were dominated all the time, they always think about them as the reference group. Reference group may, like in sociological terms, so reference group is like to the group with whom you want to relate, or you see them as ideal. So I mean, they suppress the people so much that they find their own culture, their own ways of life inferior. So, I mean, this is the during the decolonization process, the main objective is to retain one's self, like self identification and independence. Independence is not on papers only, but the independence should be like it is should be in the entire way of life. Like I should be proud of my culture, I should be proud of my ways of life. Whatever the colonization did to my culture, I shouldn't be impacted by it when and like there should be a process when this should be attacked gradually, and one should come. It is not like human beings are not like they are not the this, they are not so flexible that the pressure is gone and they come back to the previous stage. The decolonization but like it goes with the colonial impact. So this process is very painful many times, because even among the same group, several categories appear, and those categories become superior and inferior in terms of the reference group. This is what my observation is. Thank you.
Thank you, Anima. I heard you mention that it's a painful process.
Hi, Sabic. Can I put in my contributions?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Sabic. Actually, my own perspective, I see colonization as a process, like others have said, and it starts with that kind of a feeling, encroachment in the mindset, and before action. Action, it is when the colonizers actually make themselves in physical appearance in the colonized areas or the colonized countries. So I think the best first step as the way forward is to, first of all, change the mindset and philosophy. Then adaptation. You have the after colonization adaptation, because when we look critically, all the colonizers are no longer in their colonized territories. So what stops us from decolonizing ourselves? We discover is the mindset, and we don't want to change our philosophies. So, for example, ask somebody, you see a dark-skinned woman, she wants to become a white skin. You discover that that complex, that inferiority complex that she or he subdues him or herself to, that is still part of colonization, and you discover it is the mindset because you admired your colonizer being a white skin and you want to. So the measure and first step that we have to take is to change our mindset and philosophy. And by the time we change our mindset and philosophy and adapt our lifestyles to our origin, our cultures, then we discover that some aspects of, like, say, human rights might be coming into play. But now we can always know how to deal with those things. And again, in the context of the leaders, the political leaders, you need a kind of a political will to actually readapt the colonized countries to be kind of, say, autonomous, but maintaining a good collaboration with the colonial masters. In fact, I don't really like at times the continuation of the use of word colonial masters, if we can, because just the words we use at times still leaves us in colonization. Maybe we should also start changing some of the words like black, white, colonial master, colonial, all those kind of words at times, they also instigate the notion of continuous colonization. So that's my contribution, Sabic. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to mention that we have 5 minutes left. So this has been really rich. There were other 3 slides that I was going to share, but it's been really amazing. All the thought processes, so much nuances and so much, such rich thinking processes. And also I want to name and note that there's an edge. The question was looking at ourselves, right? And I realized that as the more we talk, there's an edge of distancing ourselves from the topic, right? We talking about in a general way, and it's almost like it's difficult to say, I see myself doing this and this and this, right? And this was the challenge. This was the whole idea of asking these questions, that we are able to see how difficult it is to actually really get in touch with that embodiment of what is it that I do, right? What it is that I do as Nontokozo, what is it that, how does my colonization show up? How do I behave? And what is it that I do? And what is it that I can do to change those behaviors, right? So it seems it's always easy to put a distance in a way that it's happening, but how do I identify it in myself? What are the behaviors and what are the steps that I need to take in order to change how I think and how I behave? Yeah, it's making sense.
Nontokozo, can I share?
Yes, please.
Yeah, you just mentioned, and it took me back to what you were saying about speaking English earlier. And I was telling the colleagues who I was with in the breakout room about the code switching. So there's a certain way, you speak English depending in the room that you're in. And then there's another accent that comes out when you're with your friends and your family that's totally removed. It probably won't sound like what I'm sounding now, to be honest. But the truth is, now as I'm speaking, I'm aware of the code switching. Going forward, I don't even know what it would look like to decolonize myself, because I've almost associated that with a formal working space. So now, even regardless of the race that you find me around, if it's a formal working space, the code switching happens because that's like an official way to speak. Yeah, and sometimes it's, no longer even aware of it. It takes for somebody else to point it out that, hey, you sound different between this place and the other. So I guess that's one of the things. And, another thing that I think I'm picking out, as far as colonization, I look at people like me from East Africa. The way we were taught to name ourselves, you had to have an English name first. Some of them, and we lost our African cultural way of naming, and our names had a meaning to it. It wasn't just, you just didn't name a person Rose. Why did you name a person Rose? And realizing, like, some of the names my parents gave, my sister was called Belinda because they found the name Belinda beautiful, only to find out Belinda means beautiful snake. Now, coming from where I come from in Africa, you name a person something to do with a snake. Oh my God. I'm sure if they knew then, they would never have gone anywhere near that name. But now this is a person who's 40 years old. Does she change her name? I look at my name, Namuma, it means people who plant and grow things. But the first name is Maria, which means sea of bitterness. So it's one of those, do I change my name? What does it mean now when I become more aware? I can't just throw off 40 years of being called the same name. So yeah, just putting it out there.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. Yeah, I think I can't give you a solution there, but it's almost like also looking at the work that we do now is also intergenerational, right? So we cannot fix everything. We can just start to plant seed and have awareness, and then you don't have to name your children give your children English names anymore. You can give your children the names that you want to give them that have meaning. So we're gonna have to close. So I don't know, Bianca. Yeah, I feel like I want to go on for another 2 hours. And it's rich and it's going there. But yeah, next time I feel like we can move and start to go deeper into ourselves, right? And how does it feel inside of our bodies, and what are we doing? And then again, move to community, and then come back and move into our organizations, and then come back. So again, I want to emphasize that your input is really important to us. So if you can write to Bianca and just let her know what else you want to talk about and who's available to do presentations and share your knowledge. You don't have to be an expert. You don't have to know everything, but this is for you. And we're just here to hold the space and make it possible and hold the process for all of you. So I'll pass it to you, Bianca.
Thanks so much, Nontokozo. And just a thank you to you, as always, for holding the space so well for all of us. And just to echo what Nontokozo has said, do feel free to reach out, and we will send out the survey, which it's like 2 questions or 3 questions. It's really quick and easy, but there is an opportunity on there to share any thoughts or ideas about the sessions. And we do have 4 more left, and we will be sending out information about those in the coming months. So thank you, everyone.